Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, the podcast where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire our conversations. I'm Doc Philip Brown with my good friend Dr. Terry Jackson, and you're at the intersection. Fascinating thing about intersections is that we all go through many intersections daily, and the way we navigate these intersections determines the trajectory of our day and of our life. Our topic for today, Terry, the cost of comfort.
Oh man, that's a powerful topic, the cost of comfort, because as I like to say, comfort has always been the enemy, right? And there's no growth. There's no growth if you're comfortable, right? And so whether that cost is mental, physical, psychological, there is always a cost that has to be paid.
One of the things that I've been working on a lot recently, is personal growth from the standpoint of really recognizing places where I get stuck based on something that I have in my mind from past or whatever, and something will trigger that memory or trigger that feeling, and it makes you instantly uncomfortable. And you realize that you have tons of different patterns that I myself have created over time, right? Maybe it was a good experience, maybe it was a bad experience, but it has set this pattern. And so some event, something that happens, something somebody says will kind of trigger that. And the tendency is then to go right back into that space, to attach the meaning of the past into the current situation. But it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not, the current situation doesn't necessarily reflect the past. And so the comfortable thing is to make that be the model, right? Like, the less comfortable thing is to acknowledge that, hey, this is a sort of an old trap pattern in my thinking. I'm aware of it. It might be better if I let this one go and get present in what's happening right now and recognize that it's not the same.
I do something just the opposite, right? And sometimes because I do it so quickly, I'm called dismissive, right? Or you're dismissive. No, I'm not dismissive. I just let it go, right? I do my best not to get stuck. And sometimes maybe I am being a bit dismissive. Sometimes maybe I should allow myself to get stuck just a little for understanding's sake, right? But for me, that's your deal. That's not my deal. That's your problem. I don't have to deal with that. You have to deal with that. And so you're dismissive. So in saying that, it's all about a learning process, right? It's that internal work that we have to do to learn about ourselves and to understand that there's a dividend in being uncomfortable, even though we don't like to be uncomfortable. And maybe I dismiss it so quickly so that I don't go to that place of discomfort, right? And that I am comfortable. But it's interesting when I really give it a lot of thought, because again, I haven't given it a whole lot of thought. Next.
Right.
Like, yeah, it's like the barber. Like the barber says next when they finish cutting. Yeah, let's move on to something else, right? So that's kind of how I stay comfortable.
Yeah. And I think that you described it so well that, there's some trap pattern in your thinking that you just don't really want to deal with that, whatever that is at the time, right? So you just brush it aside. And that doesn't allow you to get into a space where you might better understand, or you might learn something different, or you might have your perspective challenged. So basically, it gives you a pass to not change. The ultimate payoff almost always is that we don't have to change. If we when we're seeking comfort, what we're really seeking a lot of times is to not have to change. But we know that has its pitfalls.
Yeah. And one of the things I try to do, and I mentioned this you guys when we were doing the work at the hospital. I said, well, take a different route to work, take a different route to the bank, wake up at a different time, eat something different. Kind of make it intentional that you're going to do something out of the ordinary. You're going to take a different path. You're going to change, right? So I try to remind myself, keep that at the top of mind. Hey, I'm going down. I'm going over to this location. You know what? I need to go this way. I need to go this way. I need to do something different so I can see something different, so I can think something different, right? And so that's all a part of being able to be change ready, I want to call it. But then again, as a human being, we are creatures of habit. So guess what happens?
Yeah. Something nice to be said for that soft bed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm
going to do it tomorrow.
Yeah. The thing is that the cost of comfort is hard to quantify because you don't know what you don't know. You're shutting down opportunities for growth, for different thinking, for possibility. And so you don't know what you don't know. And that's, in my opinion, that's one of the most dangerous states to be in, yet we're in it all the time.
I've always done it this way. Yeah. We've always done it this way.
Yeah.
We're not going to change.
Yeah. And we see that, right now you see healthcare is really stuck badly in all the models that have existed for a long time. And it is amazing that we have stayed where we are because nobody seems to be satisfied with it. Certainly, if you're a patient, the experience is very difficult, right? I mean, it's oftentimes doesn't treat people with the dignity they deserve. It's a dangerous situation. Sometimes the most dangerous situation a person will ever be in is their encounter with the health system. If you're working inside the health system, it's not very good either, and we see that evidence of that is the mass exodus of the workforce. And also the survey data that says such a huge percentage of people are planning to leave the workforce. So, we know it's expensive. The government has issues covering the expenses of people that are on the Medicare rolls, right? It's the number one leading cause of personal bankruptcy in this country is healthcare expense. So there's just this profound dissatisfaction, but it's the devil, right? So people are comfortable with this level of dissatisfaction. So the question is, what does it take? What does become the stimulus for change, right? How much discomfort do you have to quit being comfortable with the system as it is?
Yeah, and the cost of comfort. It's like the CEOs, toward the end of the pandemic is not the right phrase, but as it lessened, you had the CEOs calling people back into the office spaces, right? Because you just weren't comfortable with the whole virtual setting now. People working a hybrid, going into the office and working some from home, just not comfortable with that, so we need you to come back in, versus, let me take a look at the data. Okay, we've been out of the office for X amount of time, let me compare that to the productivity of the data when we were, in the office, and then let me make a decision. And, also from a culture perspective, let me take a look at, the impact on our entire organization as it relates to hybrid models and which departments are better with hybrid models. So instead of looking at all of that data, it's just, we just need you to come back in, right? Because I'm comfortable with you being here. I can see you. versus I'm not comfortable. You're at home. I can't see you. You may be putting in some work, but what else are you doing? Right. So whatever that is, but there's truly a cost to being comfortable because, we know that to grow, there's a level of uncomfort because it's something we don't know. And we know that we don't know, but yet we're trying to learn this. And at the same time, we kind of stumble through it. And again, being a creature of habit as a human being, we love to be comfortable.
Yeah, and we see it. One of the things you see now is you and I talk about it frequently. Working out, right? And as you reach a certain age, let's just say, the stakes are actually higher in a way because if you're not willing to exercise to a certain level of discomfort, not only are you not making gains, you're actually losing.
That's right.
And we see that play out in many different environments, right? So that it reaches a point. Blockbuster is always an example, right? They wanted to be comfortable with what they were. They didn't embrace certain technologies, and so they went away. And there are many, many companies, that did this, that took the same path, right? They weren't really willing to go through the productive discomfort piece of shifting and adapting and changing, thinking that what they had was a comfortable place. Their market share was what they wanted it to be. They would thrive based on being the best at that. And then entities that were willing to be uncomfortable just changed the whole game.
That's right. I'm willing to bet that there's some of our listening audience today who don't even know who Blockbuster was.
Probably not.
Yeah. All they know is Netflix. And you remember Netflix kind of started off like Blockbuster, and then they changed the game by going to that whole streaming process, right? And which Blockbuster didn't see, and now they're no longer, right? It's just like if you ask youth today about, they don't remember the desktops. They probably remember, the laptops, right? But they definitely don't remember the typewriter. And the only time you probably see a typewriter today is probably in a church somewhere, right? Exactly. And and so the typewriter industry didn't see, word processing coming along, and then all of a sudden now it's non-existent. We can, you go back in the history and you talk about Kodak, right?
Right.
Yeah, they don't exist.
Had the first digital technology.
That's
decided
right.
It wasn't worth pursuing.
That's right. And
it would cut into their film development business.
No,
Boy, sure
yeah,
did.
yeah, that's right. So, we have to force ourselves to be uncomfortable, right? It's like you have to become comfortable being uncomfortable, and that's difficult to do. It's easier said than done, right? Because you said, the bed is soft, the sofa is soft. Man, it looks good outside. I can do this tomorrow. I'm not gonna get out there and go walking today. I can cut the grass tomorrow. Whatever it is, I'm gonna be comfortable today, right? Versus being uncomfortable because what that might bring from a physical exertion perspective, from a mental exertion perspective, or time I gotta really get into reading and understanding. Whatever that uncomfort is that creates growth.
See, I really think one of the most powerful components of being uncomfortable is that self-work. Because it is profoundly uncomfortable to challenge some of your own mental models. And without doing it, those models just stack up. And the next thing you know, you're off on an island of your personal reality, and you find yourself just always unsettled because the world really didn't pay attention to what you wanted it to be. Right.
That's
and
right.
so
That's right.
you have to go through these periods where you get uncomfortable with the way you've been conceiving of things, right? So few things are actually binary.
Yep.
There's not a right way and a wrong way. there's not a truth and a lie. It, there's a spectrum of those things, and the more we know about brain science, the more we understand. It's one of the things that actually, if you really play it out in your mind, it makes you scared as hell of what happens in courtrooms and things like that, because you realize it's all theater. And, you know, you have two different witnesses, maybe they're eyewitnesses, telling you two different things. And they're actually both right, but somebody is going to convince that jury that one of them is right and the other one is not true. And what it allows us to do is create a world that's simpler than what it is. Our world is created to be simpler, right? Like, I know there's a right and a wrong, so that's going to be the standard I apply to everything. It's really only my standard.
Yep, that's it. That's it, man. And I'll tell you, some of the greatest challenges as it relates to the cost of comfort is that is in knowledge attainment, right? Especially when it relates to our belief systems around spirituality or religion. That's where I see a lot of people get stuck, right? Because, you know, we've been indoctrinated into systems around spirituality and religion, and people can't think otherwise, because if it's not like theirs, it's got to be evil. Right?
Yeah, right.
They put something on it. You know, you got to be evil. You got to be the devil. You got to be whatever it is, because it's not like theirs.
Yeah, I've got a friend who always used to say, "Don't judge me because I sin differently than you do." It's like, you know, but there's so much truth to that. And the thing that I've found really interesting, I've been doing some study over the last several months, is the connection between modern physics and spirituality. All kinds of spirituality, whether it's Eastern mysticism or you know, Western religion. It's another one of those areas where, you know, they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And it's really fascinating that a lot of the science now is supporting what mystics have known for centuries, for thousands of years, in fact. And it's really fascinating, you know, and it's taken me to a space of, you know, trying to read about quantum physics and the theory of relativity is a headache, honestly. Like, you know, it's so far removed from physics classes I had in college and everything. It's all just, it's, you know, it's intellectually challenging to get it. So it's like a super slow read. It takes me out of, I'm a fast reader. I like to read through, you know, but when you're grappling to understand, it takes longer. And that's the whole same concept that you get in exercise, right? Like if you're trying to get really strong, you got to work out longer and harder, right? Same thing. It's going through that zone of discomfort to get the growth.
Yep, absolutely, man. And it's extremely interesting, especially when you do some of the reading and then you begin to have some conversations, and some people can't understand the conversation you're having. They wonder why you're having the conversation, or why you might even be studying just to get a better understanding of this whole universe that we're in, and more importantly, a better understanding of who you are as a person, right? Because it's always about the internal work, right? And so when you begin to talk about it, you know, people kind of look at the side eye, right?
What's wrong with him?
Yeah, exactly.
Fell and hit his head.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the side eye, because they can't fathom what that is, because they haven't made themselves uncomfortable in that whole learning process. And we know that everything is interconnected, right? And we understand, as I like to say, you can't separate the creator from the creation, or the creation from the creator. So if it's in this universe and it's been created, then we have some connection to it, because we know that every mineral in this in this universe is a part of who we are, right? So why can't I have a understanding and, to it. And like you say, what the mystics have known for a long time, and because we're in this Western society, there's a lot that we haven't been exposed to that's in the Eastern society and how they see the world and how they see things. And we should be able to marry that together.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the benefits of the shrinking world, right?
That's right.
Is that, you can get the benefit of a lot of the different perspectives. The quantum physics piece and the theory of relativity and all that really, as you begin to understand what it really means, it definitely gets easier to see how those philosophies come together with the science. And, when you think of that, we tend to put things in linear terms, right? Like whether it's life expectancy, whether it's a schedule, we think it's, 1 o'clock comes after 12.
Yeah, right.
Before 2.
Right.
And really, there's a space-time continuum. It's mathematically described.
That's right.
That's right. And it is just amazing when you think about the fact that all of the things that we see as forms are really the way energy is coming together. And some of these forms, it's a much oversimplification, but forms have a different stability, right? The average human form, unless you hit the genetic lottery, is going to give you about 91 years in a perfect world. And then that form is no longer stable. It becomes something else. What exactly, we don't know, right? You look at an oak tree that may live to be hundreds of years old. You look at a rock, and on and on. And it really underscores the importance of being present in the moment and being engaged with what's happening. This whole notion that, we've got to spend our whole lives figuring out some future is really kind of funny when you realize, let's see, planet Earth is 4.5 billion years old. I get about 90 years. What's 90 divided by 4.5 billion? Ain't very long.
No. It's just a blip, right? The blip on the screen, right? But we have this tendency to think that we are so important. And, we're living so long. Oh, he lived to be 100 years old. That's long. It is long, maybe as it relates to a human being. But in the grand scheme of things, you would hear that long, right? It's interesting because we were having a conversation earlier before we started to record this. I was telling you about this 95-year-old gentleman that I know who's still driving, and we say, wow. But in the grand scheme of things, is that really a wow? Does it really call for the wow factor? Because we're only here, in a short period of time. And then as we begin to discover knowledge that's been out there that we may not have been exposed to, right? Enables us to see things a little differently. And we live in a society and in a country where conformity is what is given a lot of value to, right? To be the conformist, to be average, really. But then when you start stepping outside of those boundaries, it becomes something different and new, right? And if you really think about it, you remember the book, The Bell Curve? You really start to get into what the bell curve is on the extremes, right? And so even though a lot of people didn't agree with that, a friend of mine brought that to me and said, hey, you need to look at it from this perspective. From, 50% here, I guess pretty much in the middle, 25. As you begin to grow, as you begin to learn more information, what happens to those who are average? And then look at, when you get out on the extreme of learning and knowledge, what actually happens, then you see that it does exist. And I said, well, you know what? I didn't look at it from that perspective. And he said, well, I'm looking at the educational system, and I can tell you right now, this is happening. Right? That's interesting because a lot of people didn't like the book, especially in the African-American community when the guys started talking about the bell curve, right? But when we look at it from what we're talking about, the introduction of new knowledge from an Eastern perspective, and we begin to take a look at quantum physics and all that, and we get outside of what we normally, what the normal average human being is going to, we begin to see things a little bit differently. And so people, well, he's a little weird, or his thoughts not like mine, so we can't have this conversation with him. And that's not the case. Maybe I'm bringing more understanding and vision to it, and I can see it from different perspective. And life is all about perspective.
Yeah, you definitely see, because you get into the sort of the adoption curve mentality as well, right? So early adopters, people think they're crazy, and then it goes through the same curve process where there's a next stage of people who adopt it once it's looks like it's okay, but it's still front waiver, if you will, and then it gets into the mainstream, and then late adopters and things like that. It's just another bell curve type phenomenon that happens. And when you put those two together, when you put somebody, who is out there in the early adopter phase, who's very far out on the bell curve in terms of achievement, then a lot of times they are thought to be crazy. What does that even mean?
Yeah. What does it mean? And as I like to tell people, if you go to, look at any kind of psychological diagnosis, crazy is not one of them. That's not a word that they use in that field, right? They might have something else to describe it, but crazy is not it. And so there's also a phrase that says, if you think something is impossible, you'll think something is impossible until you see the people doing it, right? Because there's a whole lot of people who had a lot of ideas and everybody thought they were crazy, and then all of a sudden we're living and we're utilizing those same crazy processes or those same crazy products that was created, at least people thought were crazy at the time. Who would have thought about, I'm riding a horse one day and then I'm going to drive this motorized vehicle, right? Not a whole lot of people thought about, that at the time. They thought the horse was going to be it, right? And then, and so now they're talking about probably the next 5 years having the flying car. We saw it on the Jetsons back in the 70s.
That's right.
But now it looks like we might be living in it in 2028.
Idea's been out there for a while.
Yes, it has been.
Yeah. And it's, it's another one of those things where there's a bit of a balance, right? Is that, comfort in and of itself doesn't have to be a negative, right? There are certain things that we can do that are valuable comforts, but we just can't live there all the time in such a way that we insulate ourselves from the stimuli for change. So when we encounter different things that are outside of our personal realm of experience, being able to sit with the discomfort that brings is really important. And it's really the formula behind understanding one another. It gets back to the whole differential experience thing, and it doesn't even mean that one experience is good and one experience is bad. They just are.
Yep.
And we have to figure out how to navigate those differences in productive ways, which means that at any given time, discomfort is going to exist, and it's important.
Yep, all the time. It exists all of the time. And even though we may not want to admit that it exists all the time, but it does. And we're always stepping into it, not realizing that we're stepping into it. It's like ambiguity and uncertainty. It's always existed. More so now because of the pandemic, but like being uncomfortable, the label of good and bad is what I think drives a lot of the thought around that, right? If we can just remove the label and associate it with growth, I think it's much better. I've always said that the connotation of words sometimes causes us to not go in certain directions. We is it good? Is it bad? Or we want to place a label on it. Well, to be uncomfortable, we associate that with being something negative. But I know that if I go from the first grade to the second grade and I got to learn something new, there's a level of intellectual uncomfortability that comes with that because I don't know it. So that means I got to learn, I got to study, I got to practice. That's the work that we don't want to put in, right?
Yeah, and it starts with the notion that it's hard to admit we don't know.
That's right.
It makes us feel maybe inferior in some kind of way. And one of the interesting things that, as a part of this creativity and personal mastery process that I've tried to make my own model around is recognition when I feel that discomfort that there's growth potential.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of use the alternate reality exercise a fair bit now. And so when I feel this sense of discomfort that I can't tell, maybe it just feels like things are unsettled or something just that I can't even put my finger on, I've created a model in my own mind where I say, this is the time where I'm supposed to really be paying attention, where I'm really supposed to be observing and not judging what's happening right now. This is a growth time, and it's hard to do. It is hard to do, but you really do get clarity over time. It's kind of a constant. It takes constant effort to stay in that space, and it's actually okay. One of the tools I use is write it down because, it's okay to leave that space of discomfort, but you probably ought to come back to it, right? But if it gets to be too much, it's okay to just sort of shut it down for the day or the hour, or take a break, get into a different space for a while, but then revisit it and figure out, like, okay, what evidence am I seeing of whatever it is I'm supposed to be picking up on right now? And there's always some.
That's right. That's right. Constant gentle pressure, right? Going back to center, going back to revisit, right? Going back to revisit, constant gentle pressure. Sometimes I ask myself during the day, so what can I do right now to make myself uncomfortable? I'm comfortable. I'm not doing a whole lot. What can I do to make myself uncomfortable? Let me go out and, jog, exercise. Let me do something that I'm not comfortable with. Let me play in physics a little bit. Let me play in chemistry a little bit, It has to be intentional.
Has to be intentional.
It has to be intentional. We got to make it a part of our life to be uncomfortable, because we've been taught that everything is about becoming as comfortable as you possibly can, right? But we know through just playing sports, especially when we would go back from the summertime and it's, football or basketball, and basketball practice is coming up and you haven't done a lot. You start running and shooting, and all of a sudden, you're uncomfortable because maybe your wind isn't where it should be because you haven't been practicing. You get your body gets a little sore, right? Because you're doing things with it that it wasn't accustomed to prior to, and you get a little sore. But that brings about the growth in the muscles, right? That brings about the growth in I'm not going to say the perfection, but the improvement on your skill set, right? It sharpens the skill set, right? And so with all of that, we know the benefit of it, but we don't like to see it as being something that is uncomfortable.
Yeah, like skip that part. Like I always remember that transition for me, which was from cross-country season to basketball season. And so I was in great shape from a cardiovascular standpoint, But what was different was the whole, especially defensive stance and all of that. Those muscles hadn't been used like that. in quite some time, and so you have to kind of retool that, and it takes a couple of weeks. That's and that discomfort part is that muscle soreness and all, where the muscle is just shifting
Yep.
into a different type mode. Now, we are going to take a little break here and talk a little bit about some resources that we have. So I'm going to plug Do You Speak Patient? That's my book. It's just been out now for about a month, and getting some really interesting commentary on it. I would love to have folks go to docphilipbrown.com and reach out through that website through to contact us and let me know what you think about it. There's also a link there to buy it and a link to all the social media profile that I have on docphilipbrown.com. But love to know what you think about Do You Speak Patient, which is really a journal type book that enables people who are in the health profession or people who are experiencing the health profession from the patient side to write down their experiences and get a better understanding of how we could potentially improve the industry.
And, a little plug for your book as it relates to the cost of comfort, right? There may be a group of health professionals who are at the bedside who are just not comfortable having the conversations, right? Maybe it's just not who their personality is, and so they have to learn what it means to have the conversation with the patient to make sure. And so they step outside of their comfort zone so that they can learn how to speak patient. As it relates to co-creation leadership, there are lots of leaders out there who like to just pretty much make the decision on their own. They don't like to have a collaborative effort in creating the best solutions for organizations. And then when you start talking about transformational thinking, trying to think different in and of itself is uncomfortable. And that whole process is uncomfortable. But the fruit of transformational thinking and the fruit that's derived from co-creation leadership definitely works toward the greater good of humanity. Along with that, for Do You Speak Patient? Because at the end of the day, everything we do, we're dealing with human beings. And so we want to be able to engage in such a way that you're comfortable being uncomfortable because you understand that's how we make progress.
Well, the co-creation piece it really gets to this comfort concept because as a single individual, you can only take that so far, right? You can only experience so much discomfort because that's going to be based on what's within your personal experience. The concepts of co-creation are to co-opt the experiences of different people together in such a way that you can reach whole new levels.
Yes.
So that's why now in the complex world that we live in, sort of the leader is king is a concept that is dead. And even though we still see it play out in certain environments, that's still dead. And you're seeing those industries that are still doing it that way experience instability.
That's right. I would agree with that 100%. Even in the tech industry, as we see some of these tech companies fall by the wayside, right? They've become comfortable in doing what they've done because, again, as the statement says, we've always done it this way. So that means we're comfortable doing it this way. And we don't want to become uncomfortable doing it this way, right? And what happens is you see the decline of these organizations. And we know that as we continue to grow as human beings, we have to be able to see things from different perspectives. We have to be able to bring in new knowledge. We have to be able to let go of old knowledge. We have to be able to let go of old processes. We have to understand that life is an iterative experience that we have to continue to add on to.
And that experience piece is so fascinating because one of the questions that I have come upon in the reading and everything that I use on myself all the time is, when I feel unsettled, when I feel uncomfortable, I say, who is that? Mm-hmm. Who's uncomfortable? Mm-hmm. and it gets you to the point of understanding that concept of consciousness, what real consciousness means, right? It doesn't mean that you're hung up in whatever drama is happening in front of you. It means that you're aware of that drama happening in front of you, and you're aware of what it's making you think, and you're aware of how it's making you feel. And you take those three things, what you're seeing from the environment, how you're feeling about it, and what you're thinking about it, and you realize you're actually a level up from that. And it's the whole detachment concept. And a lot of, leadership experts talk about the whole concept of detachment all the time. Jocko Willink does a great piece on it. And, it's that question that you can ask yourself in the moment, right? Who is it that's uncomfortable with the current situation? And you realize it's, you're feeling it, but you're more than that, right? And so that gives you the strength and the level of detachment that you need to weather that and understand better what's happening and be able to take that bird's eye view of a bigger constellation than just what's inside you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. That was so perfectly stated. And I'm going to attach one word. You attach the word woke. I'm going to use its synonym, and that is woke. And I use that because we're hearing that a lot in this whole political. It's been used politically to look down on it, but all it means is that I'm awakened to all of that that's going on around me, right? And do you want me to be woke or do you want me to be asleep? Well, from a political perspective, they want you to be asleep.
So they can do whatever they want
Exactly. But when you are aware, which is, I think, the greatest place you can be, versus, that awareness at some point in time will bring some clarity, one way or the other. But to be aware of that. And I love that question is, who is this that is afraid of this, or who is this, to ask yourself that question, because we do have different roles that we play on a day-to-day basis, employee, father, son, all that kind of thing. So what part of me, because that's what you're asking, what part of me is either shying away from this or being attracted to this, and then why? Right? Yeah. And then why am I either attracted to this or not attracted to this? And what's the impact on me because of how I feel one way or the other? That's the deep work.
And it's a powerful tool for processing, right? Like the deep work is the right way to say it, because, one of the things that I have found is that by going on that line of questioning, right? Like so who is it that's disturbed by this, meaning, what part of me? Then the next level is, why is that? What it allows you to do is bring up things from your past that are not really well processed. You've buried it because you're attached to it in a negative way, or you're clinging to it in a negative way. And if you let those things pass, it gives you a chance to basically be free of that burden, right? I think Dr. Rouse says, it's like carrying suitcases on the train, right? Yeah. The train is strong enough to carry you and the suitcases, so you can put them down.
Right.
They'll still get there.
That's right.
And it's the same process, right? Is you're getting to your, what is in there that is blocking me from the full experience, because that's really what it is. Anytime we feel that discomfort well up inside, whether it's anger, frustration, fear, gleefulness, we have to acknowledge that we may be missing the full experience because we're attaching something else from our past onto it in a way that is perhaps blocking some of what's really there. And when you get to that point where you're really doing that, it's like a weight off your shoulders. You know, and it doesn't mean you can stay there.
Right.
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 Like you get fleeting moments of it along the way, right? But it is a journey. And, you know, as you get better at it, it does seem like a lot of the things that repeatedly cause you problems just don't anymore.
Right.
And
They
that's
disappear.
nice.
That's right. They disappear. They either disappear, or you know better how to deal with it when that situation or something like that arises. Okay, I recognize it. I'm aware of it. So now I can deal with it a little bit better. I recognize, I understand, and I can move on after a period much quicker than I did before. So it's just that pure recognition of where you are, right, is a great skill to be able to develop, because too often as we're moving through life, we don't really recognize, okay, wow, this is the state. Here's why. How do I use it and I still move on with it, right? We just kind of, I'm going to call it autopilot. We're just on autopilot, right? We just keep moving. It's just like, you know, I'm headed to a destination and I'm driving, and I miss everything in between. Only thing I know is I left this particular area and I arrived at my destination, but I didn't see anything in between, right? Because I was on autopilot, versus being aware of, you know, every street sign, every stoplight, you know, the bird on the limb of that bush, you know, the person walking across the street. I saw all of those things because I was aware of my travel versus being on autopilot.
We have so many triggers, right? And, you know, sometimes folks get better at recognizing their triggers and all, but, you know, it's worth discussing. The thing about those triggers is that basically when a trigger gets tripped by some situation, it's really taking you back. It's always taking you back to something that is trapped from your past. It can be good, it can be bad, if you want to use that dichotomy. But it can be something that you sense as pleasant or something that you sense as unpleasant. But whenever that trigger is tripped, all of a sudden, really, you go there and you apply that rule book from that situation to the current state, and it never quite fits, right? Like it might be close, and we'll be really good at making it be a close fit. But what happens in there when you do that is, again, we're missing part of the whole picture of what's really happening. And we've just imposed our past. And, you know, in the sense of, if it's a frustrating situation from the past, we're going to stay frustrated until either we release that frustrating experience, or until we bury this now secondary frustrating experience that's frustrating because we attach something from the past onto it.
Yeah.
And so really the deep work is when those triggers get tripped, and you find yourself, I find myself in that situation where I just feel like things are not right. I need to know why that is. I need to let it go. And I need to stay right where I actually am, not where my trigger took me back to.
Yeah, you know, what resonated for me and what came to mind was I started thinking about best practices. So sometimes I'll say, well, okay, because we're talking about, we got a new situation and we're going to use an older model, because that's really what a best practice is. It is an old model. So I go from best practice to what is the next practice, right? Given the data, the stimuli, that's going to take me back to an experience that I've had before, a very similar experience. I don't want to necessarily apply that model 100%. That model may be applied with a tweak to it, which makes it the next practice versus the best practice, because we know that this old model is not going to fit 100% for this new situation that just, you know, created itself. And as a result of that, that's what the next practice. And so we're always moving into next practices at least in my opinion, there'll be a ton of people who will disagree with me because they'll keep going to the best practice. And they can say, well, the best practice is the next practice. But it has to have a tweak to it because no two situations are going to be 100% alike.
Well, the essence of innovation.
That's
right?
it.
I mean, that really is the essence of innovation. And, you know, we can gauge a lot of times the need for innovation based on the current state, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we have something that we have great satisfaction with the process and with what it's turning out, the need for timely innovation is less than if we have something that is not that way. And, you know, we have definite examples of each of those that we see every day, you know. And so it really is it's a cue. And the question is, you know, when will we have a critical bandwidth of folks that recognize that cue and are willing to go through the discomfort to change, to innovate in a positive way.
That's right.
Maybe
That's
it's
right.
AI.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Maybe it's
That's
healthcare
right.
in
That's
general.
right. That's
Maybe
right.
it's health. You know, like lots of examples.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to show you how people don't want to be uncomfortable, you hear people make the statement from time to time, man, don't change. Don't change. Remain the same. Why should I remain the same? There's no growth in remaining the same, right? Man, I just want to commend you because you never changed. Well, if I never changed, something's wrong because that means I didn't learn anything. Whether it was a positive or negative experience, I didn't learn anything. If I read a book, a new book that gave me new knowledge, and I didn't change because this new knowledge helped me change, then something's wrong. Because I'm supposed to change. If I know how to now apply something better in my life, that is supposed to change my life. That's the only. How I heard someone say, change is the first law of nature. I think I heard someone say that.
Yeah, I mean, gotta be, right? I mean, and when you know better, doing better should be a byproduct.
Right. It's a constant. It's the only
Clearly.
constant. Yeah, change is the only constant because if I sit down to read a book, even if I've read that book before, I should learn something new from that I can apply, which meant that I added on to my foundation of who I am, and it's going to help me change in one way or the other.
Yeah, I had that experience recently. I read and then reread within 2 weeks 2 Michael Singer books, The Untethered Soul and Living Untethered. And the process of, I read, they're both short. I recommend both of them highly, but read each of them in a day. And so in between that I had almost 2 weeks of thinking about it, behavior change based on it, and then read it again. And picked up a bunch of deeper understanding of those things based on the period of work in between. You know, and there are lots of things. All the great works are like that, you know, we get a chance to reinterpret based on how we're different at the time, hopefully how we've grown over the time.
And oftentimes there are not enough words in the vocabulary to describe what that growth may be, right? Oftentimes you can't describe it, but people will see it.
Right. Yeah, the language is inadequate to the breadth of the human experience.
That's right.
Without a doubt.
That's right.
It kind of reminds me, you know, one of the things that has been interesting in my career is, you know, it's relatively less common, or at the time that I did it, for physicians to make the transition completely out of clinical practice and into executive leadership. And it's interesting. For me, it was incredibly valuable because it allowed a level of detachment that for me was productive and healthy and enabled me to see things in a different way. Controversial within the profession, there definitely are those who see it as a negative to be completely out because they think that, you know, if you're not in the front line trenches that you can't possibly know. I personally think that's backwards thinking because you need some detachment and probably would do everybody some good to at least have periods where they detach and can look. But that level of detachment really helped me gain a lot of clarity and see things differently from not in the heat of the battle on the day to day. And what you see is this field of dynamic factors that have to be balanced in different ways. And again, it's in an equilibrium fashion. It is not an even balance all the time. It shifts. It has to. And all the different factors that exist always cause those shifts, and all the tensions are healthy if you get them in the right proportion at a given time. And that process has to be dynamic based on what we're seeing. So an example would be during COVID, that created all kinds of massive shifts in hospital-based healthcare to deal with the onslaught of the magnitude of illness that we were seeing. And in some cases we got that right, in some cases we got that wrong. We learned we got it increasingly right over time. But that was an excellent example of how things had to shift as we learned about it. And now we find ourselves in a fundamentally different place. It was a very difficult time. A lot of people lost their lives. Some of those were because of the way it was handled in situations. Some of it was because of the nature of what we were facing. But we learned and we got better at it as an industry. And hopefully we will learn as a larger system some things not to do about it, because it was a perfect setup to basically do things in stages where you make some decisions about the way that things need to go, and you execute on those to a particular point in time, and then you reevaluate and say, how do we need to change? And that guidance needs to be clear. And that's where it wasn't, and at the same time, there has to be that understanding that, hey, this is going to change because we're going to learn and we're going to do better out of it. And as we take that out into our lives, we have a chance to do some really magnificent things.
And what you just described, we all have to take a look at it, not just from the healthcare perspective, but from the personal perspective, right? All that you just described is really about how humans make progress. Taking a look at a situation or experience that happens in our life, evaluating it, breaking it down, understanding it, and moving forward one way or the other, right? It's a process. And what we are saying is this real internal work that has to happen is a process. And I'm going to say that this internal work happens whether it's intentionally or unintentionally. You see those who happen to be more aware, or those who are just not aware at all. But the process is still happening. There's a development that's happening. It's like we talk about culture. Culture will happen intentionally or it'll happen by abdication, meaning that it'll develop itself. So if you don't develop as a human intentionally, there's going to be development there, right? You may not even look at it as development, and you might not think that you have any control, but you do. But it has to be, intentional, and you have to continue to examine your thoughts and your actions. What is it? The unexamined life is not worth living. It's a constant examination of life, of thought, of actions, of experiences. That's just a human experience. It should be. Maybe some people just go along in life without examining. And That's just existing.
Yeah, you sure see folks that appear to be trapped in their own pattern. You know, and one of the things that's really within all of us to do is to change our pattern. Right? We can't necessarily change the outside forces that are happening in a moment, but we can change our pattern. We can change the way our responsiveness is to those things. And inevitably that's going to change what's happening.
Right.
It's a false logic to think that it's just, I've changed the way I'm responding, so only I have changed, but things are better. It's actually that because I've changed the way I'm responding, some other things change too. And so then we got to repeat that.
That's right.
Right. And repeat that again. And ultimately, if we go through that cycle more and more, ultimately we end up in better places for ourselves. We learn from the effectiveness of the model we're using. We adapt that model to something that works better for us at the time. And we're all geared toward that. We're all geared toward acting in our own perceived best interest at a given time. That's just what we do. And that can play out to look altruistic or not, but it's always really that decision process is ours to make, and it's always us acting in our own perceived self-interest. Where it really gets, trained off the tracks is when we're bringing a bunch of stuff in from the past into the current state, and it limits our options. If our options are unlimited based on liberating ourselves from things in our past, then we'll always have better choices in terms of how to go forward.
Yeah, I think Stephen Covey said between stimulus and response, there's choice, right? And as we make those different choices, we change our patterns. And I've come up with this phrase and says, how can you make chaos your friend? You make chaos your friend by understanding the patterns and changing those patterns, because within chaos there are patterns. You just got to be able to recognize those patterns.
Absolutely. And often it's uncomfortable, which
That's
brings us
right.
to the end of the time. I hope you guys have enjoyed visiting with us here on Unlikely Intersections. Check us out at unlikelyintersection.com or Unlikely Intersections on YouTube and Facebook. Find me at docphilipbrown.com. There's a link to all my social media profiles as well as to all these episodes on that website. And Terry?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Terry Jackson, PhD. You can go to my website, jcgconsultinggroup.com. You can find me on our YouTube page, where we'd like for you to go and like, comment, and share all of our episodes, because we understand that this unlikely conversation or this unlikely intersection is made up of tough conversations and conversations that we need to have.
We'll see you at the next intersection.